Jessy here. I love resin 3D printers, and I really love large resin 3D printers. And today I want to give you 5 tips on working with these larger 3D printers, especially since some of you out there might be getting your very first large resin 3D printers, like the Elegoo Jupiter, which is starting to ship out to its original Kickstarter backers. But before I can do that, I need to get my Jupiter over here to the studio. So now that I've got my Jupiter up and running here in the studio and I've run off and done some prints, let's talk about some of the things that you need to be considerate of or thinking of when it comes to actually working with these larger 3D printers. And regardless if it's a small resin 3D printer or a large one, there are some basic things that you're going to have to consider, like disposable gloves, some filters for filtering out your resin, isopropyl alcohol or something to clean your resin 3D prints, as well as paper towels or shop towels, because let's face it, it's kind of messy. And the messy factor actually leads me into the very first item that I really recommend you have for these larger units, and that's a silicone mat. As some of you might have seen in my previous videos, I'm a pretty big fan of the WhamBam SlapMats. They're really nice, thick, durable silicone, work great and come in 2 different sizes, a smaller size, which is great for your smaller resin 3D printers, and then these larger sizes, which are great for any of your projects that you're dealing with on these larger resin 3D printers, just so that you have extra room for all of these prints, easy to wipe down, etc. But one other thing that I wanted to recommend is actually picking up a larger silicone mat, is have these sitting underneath them, specifically in the front of them there, so that anytime that I'm taking the build plate out or the vat out, any chance of me spilling resin is going to be contained on these silicone mats. I really can't emphasize this enough. When you have those larger build plates, you are going to have an excess amount of resin that's going to come off of those prints, especially when you're getting it out of the printer, and you don't want to be getting resin all over your workshop or your spaces or wherever it is that you have your printer set up. Having something like this in place makes your cleanup process so much easier. Now, the next one almost completely eliminates the need to use a metal spatula for removing your 3D prints off the build plate. And that's by installing one of these magnetic flex plates that I've got installed here on my Elegoo Jupiter. This one's made by the folks over at WhamBam, and at the time of recording this, it's, as far as I know, the only one available right now that fits the Jupiter, but there's a number of options available out there depending on which 3D printer you're using when it comes to magnetic flex plates. And why I love working with these so much is that they're just really easy to work with, especially on your larger resin 3D printers. You're not having to worry about prying away or damaging your build plate while removing these larger prints, which also means you can spend less time getting your prints off the build plate and more time actually 3D printing things. And by the way, all of the files that I'm printing in today's video are from the latest Loot Studios Cyber release, and yeah, they're pretty awesome. Now, before I talk with you about tips on cleaning and curing your larger 3D prints that you get off of these big resin 3D printers, I wanted to talk with you quickly about how you can more easily take out the resin that's inside your vats on these larger printers. That itself can be a whole learning curve that you're going to have to go through without making a gigantic mess. The Jupiter here, its vat holds almost 2 full liters of resin, which is incredible. And what you don't want to do is just be lifting that directly out of the printer and then trying to pour that out of the vat directly back into a bottle. Danny over at the 3D Printing DM over here on YouTube made a great video on this, and he showed off how you can use a vacuum pump, I think is what it's called, to actually pump out the resin from your vat back into the bottles. And I've actually ordered 2 different vacuum pumps that I wanted to show off and use in this video. I haven't used them yet because I can't find them. I moved them here into the studio along with a ton of other stuff, and I have no idea where I put it. What I do have that I use regularly is a huge syringe. This is a brand new one that I bought off of Amazon that's even larger than the one that I used back at my house in my 3D printing space. This easily allows you to suck up resin directly out of the vat and then spit it back into the bottles that it came from. And what makes this great is that you're going to help reduce the amount of resin that's in the vat so that you can more easily lift it out of the printer and then pour out or clean out any of the remaining resin. If you haven't noticed, there's a recurring theme of minimizing the mess that you're going to make with these larger units, because the larger you go, the more of a mess you're potentially going to be making with these machines. One tip when working with the syringes here, the large ones, is you want to try your best after working with it to clean it out, because what you don't want to have happen is that resin to cure or solidify inside the syringe, or at least keep the two parts separated. That way it's not going to congeal together and allow you to not get it out, because I've definitely run into that issue before. And wow, this one's so big I can almost fit my hand in there, and now I've got the paper towel stuck. Another alternative is just to squirt a little bit of IPA inside there and swish it around to help clean up any of that loose resin that's inside there. And I'm squirting it into one of my tank holders. Now, when it comes to cleaning your resin 3D prints off of a large resin 3D printer, your typical smaller wash and cure station more than likely isn't going to cut it. And Elegoo does have a larger wash and cure option called the Mercury X bundle that's designed for the Elegoo Saturn, but unfortunately not the Jupiter. And depending on the 3D prints that you're going to be working with, this might not be a large enough option for you. And fingers crossed, in the future, we'll hopefully see a larger wash and cure option, even if it's just a wash station for the Jupiter. And thankfully, everything that I printed today actually will fit in any of the wash and cure options that I have currently. But if you have something that you've printed that's really large and isn't going to fit in one of those, here are a few options for you. The first one I'm going to recommend is a very basic one, and that's just simply getting a spray bottle and filling it with IPA or denatured alcohol and spraying down your 3D print. Pairing this with a toothbrush is honestly a perfect way to clean up, at least get a good amount of the residual residue of the resin off of your 3D prints before you try and clean them even further. And to do that, I'll sometimes even use a large 5-gallon bucket and fill this up with something like mean green, because there's no way I'm gonna be filling this entire 5-gallon bucket up with isopropyl alcohol. That would just be insane. But as long as I've sprayed the prints down prior to actually sticking them in the bucket here, it makes the cleaning process a lot easier, especially when you're trying to print things like helmets or partial prints of helmets or armor or other larger cosplay pieces there. Having something like a bucket that you can dunk your prints in and out of makes your process of cleaning a lot easier. And here's a little bonus tip for you all. Regardless of the size of your resin 3D printer, if you're printing lots of things, I highly recommend grabbing some of these lunch trays that you can get off of Amazon. It just makes it an easy way. Once you've got everything cleaned off and you're waiting for it to dry, you can set these on these little trays and then move them wherever you need to. It just makes the process of freeing up space a lot easier. And before we move on to curing the supports, we need to talk about removing the supports from our 3D prints. Now, you could go the traditional way of just prying the supports directly off of the 3D prints, or if you want to make your life a little bit easier, especially on those larger 3D prints that are going to have potentially denser, heavier supports, one of the go-tos that a lot of people use is just a bucket of hot water. So you've already cleaned off all of the resin from your prints, and you can dunk it in some hot water for just a few seconds, and it'll make removing the supports so much easier. But one of my new favorite ways to remove supports doesn't require hot water at all. You're just gonna use a heat gun. So not only does this help in aiding drying off your resin 3D prints that you've cleaned, but it's also going to do the same process of loosening up those supports by heating them up. And they just pop right off. I now don't really ever use hot water or the crock pot to remove my supports. The heat gun does an absolutely amazing job, especially if you're dealing with some of those larger 3D prints, again, that might have some thicker supports. So satisfying. Now, once you've got all of your prints cleaned up and all the supports removed, it's time to actually cure them. And your prints, depending on the size, might fit in something like the Mercury X cure station. But if they're too large, here's another great option. And here's a big metal bucket that works fantastic for curing my resin 3D prints, and all I did was add a UV lamp that I can shine down into the bucket. And if you want to get really fancy, you can add 2 UV lights to the bucket to give it better coverage. But what's great is that the metal sides give a nice little reflective coating there to allow you to cure the 3D print while you can also move it around and reposition it as needed. Even on some of my huge resin 3D printers, I've been able to fit full-size helmets inside this bucket, it's been a really low cost effective way for me to cure my prints without having to just sit them outside in the sun to cure. I also tried installing UV light strips inside the bucket to give it just overall better coverage, and the UV lights on those strips just weren't powerful enough. Maybe you can find some that are stronger and that might work better for you. Again, just a really low budget, simple way to have a large curing station. Now I do have one extra bonus one here to throw into the mix, and that's making sure that you put a screen protector on these larger 3D printers. I know that's sort of a no-brainer, especially on some of the smaller units, but with these huge ones, you for sure need to protect those screens because the cost to replace them is going to be drastically higher than a smaller resin 3D printer. I did also want to say a big thank you to today's video sponsor, which is Elegoo, the makers of the Elegoo Jupiter. As I'd mentioned, this was initially a Kickstarter 3D printer, and some of the folks that backed the campaign are starting to receive their machines. Now, Elegoo also makes some other amazing resin 3D printers like the Elegoo Mars series of printers, including the Elegoo Mars 3, which is my personal favorite, the Elegoo Saturn, and the Elegoo Saturn S. And if you're interested in FDM 3D printing, they also make that amazing Elegoo Neptune 2. If you're interested in more information about any of Elegoo's products, you'll find links to those down below. And hopefully this video was helpful for some of you out there that are interested in getting started with larger resin 3D printers, or maybe you already have one and just needed some extra tips and tricks here along the way. If you have other suggestions on tips and tricks for your large resin 3D printers, let me know down below because I'd love to check those out and see how they work in my workflow. Also, if you're interested in more information about my resin 3D printing settings, you can find those over in my Patreon, and a huge thank you to my Patreon supporters for your continued support. And I'm really excited that I finally got the Jupiter here over in the new studio, so you can anticipate seeing some new project videos with this machine in the upcoming weeks. Hey, I just want to say thanks again for watching, and I'll see you again next time. Bye now.